With that, Brad, I will let you do your thing.
Sounds good, Heidi. Thanks for having me back again, and
Yeah.
welcome to everybody else. And excited to talk about DISC with you today as part of Cloverleaf. And as Heidi was mentioned, so many different assessments to bring all kinds of value. Today's goal is to do a little bit of a deep dive kind of into DISC and really kind of speak a little bit more to understanding the DISC profile and how you might be able to use it in your coaching services and the work that you're doing with your clients. And so I have a handful of nuggets of wisdom or hopeful nuggets of wisdom to share for you today. But one of the things that I always like to do with presentations like this is kind of hear about what you'd like to learn about today. If there's some specific things that would be helpful for you to see or experience that I can kind of weave into today's discussion. And so as I kind of get started here, if you have a particular question or something in particular you're looking to see as we get going today, feel free to drop it in the chat now, and I'll kind of keep an eye on those and see how I can kind of weave some of your specific questions into what I've prepared, or even maybe take a little bit of a detour if it's something beyond that that's maybe not kind of in that space. So that open invite's there. And what I find, like with most group experiences, more of you and less of me usually makes it a better experience. And so we'll kind of take it from that perspective. So feel free to drop in your thoughts kind of at any time. And in the meanwhile, while you're bringing in some of your questions, I'm going to go ahead and kind of just get the discussion going and talking about the value of Cloverleaf and the value of you. And so, one of the things in my role at the Growth Coach, I have a coaching practice in the Columbus, Ohio area, but I also coach other coaches in our network throughout North America. And, one of the things that try to help them understand the best way to sort of maximize the value of Cloverleaf is kind of understanding their role when we're using the data coming from the system. And so, I always try to frame it this way. The client's job is to, be able to get those results from Cloverleaf, and that we don't necessarily, they don't have to be experts in understanding assessments. We need them to know where to find the right information, and we need to know, they need them to understand how to use the data to drive improvements for them. And so for us as coaches, yeah, we need to understand kind of how the assessments work and things of that nature. But more importantly, we need to be able to show them where to find things. We need to show them how they can use that data, how they can be aware of that data and some of the broader connections to maybe some of the things they've talked about in terms of how we can improve their worlds and some of the issues that they're taking on as we engage with them. And we want to talk about some of the data and observations and reflect it in our own coaching and facilitation. And I'll talk a little bit about more of that as we're going through here. But having that Cloverleaf data should give you some good insights and thoughts on, how do I want to approach this team? How can I communicate with them best? How can I approach this individual when it comes to coaching and consulting with them? And ultimately, our job is to give folks the confidence to be able to change behaviors and give them some basic explanations of how the assessment tools work. And my goal for you today is to at least give you some additional insights to try to dive in a little bit from a DISC perspective and understand kind of how you can provide some of that additional understanding with folks on a one-to-one basis or with a group. So with that, then, let me talk about kind of when I think DISC makes sense. And so for me in my practice, what I've found is the good times to use DISC and to highlight DISC data are when you're forming new teams. It's also good when you want to help people understand the behavior differences sort of outside of Cloverleaf. And then what I mean by that is, of all the Cloverleaf assessments, I feel like DISC is probably the easiest one for them to be able to understand the terminology, what it means, and then observe it in the outside world when they don't have the benefit of having that data in front of them. Maybe when they're dealing with a customer or maybe a third-party partner, things of that nature. So it's helpful when we've got a lot of folks that are having to work kind of outside of Cloverleaf. It's great for first-time leaders because it's a good tool to help them understand that not everybody thinks and sees things the same way and how to approach those folks. It's also good if it's their first time using assessments because it's a good sort of gateway drug into some other assessments, if you will, from my experience, because it's easy to understand and easy to work with. And it's also great when you've got folks that have maybe used DISC in the past. And I know sometimes folks maybe hesitate to go there a little bit, but being able to show them how their environment changes and how that impacts some of their data as they've grown and evolved over time in their careers can be some valuable insight as well and some things to look at. And so these are some times when I'm working with my clients and we're trying to figure out, hey, do we want to start? These are usually some of the best places that I start to take a look at in terms of when to use DISC. And here's some reasons why for that. So from a simplicity standpoint, 4 styles, much easier to remember. I love the Enneagram. I love 16 types. I use them. I get a lot of value out of them. But to kind of get people kind of building their chops in this space, I think the DISC provides that level of simplicity. And then the beauty of just having 2 primary constructs to consider, and I'll break those out here for you a little bit, I think really helps simplify the power of the DISC. Next thing is it's observable, right? And so the DISC is what I see about me and how others see me. The Enneagram and 16 types are a little bit more kind of under the hood a little bit. And so DISC works in those other scenarios I talked about because it's all observable behavior, and it becomes really easy to point out some of those different examples with a team or with individuals as you're working through with them. It's also relatable. Most people have heard of it, or they've heard of a variation of it. I always get to hear, is that the one with the colors, or is that the one with the animals, or things like that? And so I have to kind of explain, yeah, kind of, but a little bit different. But people tend to be more open to engage in things that they have some connection to or some relationship with. So starting with the DISC can be helpful because it's relatable. It's also because the data is public, and since it's observable behavior, and what I mean by public is I can see these behaviors in you. I see DISC behaviors in Heidi every time I'm talking to her on a phone call or see her in a Zoom. You're observing maybe some DISC personality behaviors about me right now. And so all those things are observable. And so it makes it a much easier discussion to have and start to break down some of those barriers and getting people comfortable with being open to kind of talking about themselves and their others and potential strengths and weaknesses. I think one of the crucial things about DISC is it speaks to both communication and work styles. And I see this challenge a lot with businesses where culture is really important to them. And so they want to do things to hire people that kind of fit their culture. But sometimes what they don't realize is they're actually just hiring people that think like them or have similar styles to them. And that's not necessarily culture. There's a whole bunch of other things related to values, motivating values, other assessment data. We can show what that difference looks like. But we really need to be able to show folks that, you know, in the DISC, we can talk about relationships and how we communicate with each other. But there's also some work style tendencies that may make somebody that gets along great with one another, maybe not necessarily the best people to work together. And if you know the DISC pretty well and you've ever been in a meeting with a bunch of eyes, you know what this is like, because it's taken you 25 minutes to start the agenda because you've just been talking about all the fun stuff you did last night before starting your meeting. And then the nice thing about this too is it's not right or wrong, right? And so styles, like everything we look at, are tendencies. And the real test or the real opportunity for folks is helping them understand to choose the right style and approach at the right time. And so the fact that it's not right or wrong and it can be situational makes it another good place to start with clients, especially if they've fit some of those scenarios I talked about previously. And so one of the things that I think is super helpful when I try to help people understand DISC, and as well as working with my clients to try to simplify for them, is really helping them understand there's really 2 major constructs that are going on when we look at the DISC. The first one is, are you more motivated by tasks or by people? And then the second one is, do you see the world around you as a more of an assertive orientation or a more responsive orientation? And I'll explain all of those for you here in the next couple of slides. The first thing I want to look at is that notion of task versus people. And so when we are dealing with the DISC, we are really trying to find out, like, a core motivator for folks. Is it getting things done? And when I say task related things, I'm talking about things like overcoming challenges, getting excited about getting a lot of things completed, a volume of work. Maybe it's the intellectual challenge of solving problems or figuring things out that haven't been figured out before, or kind of overcoming some of the obstacles to make those things happen. And so when your primary motivation with somebody, or when you're working with somebody, their primary motivation is more task, they're typically in that DC space, because D and C are really identifying people that are task focused in the work that they're doing and more motivated by really the work or the tasks than maybe necessarily by the relationships or the people. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that if you're a D or a C that you hate people or anything like that. But what we're really getting down to is that core motivator, like what really drives you or what really excites you. If we go to the other side of the page there with the ISs, these are the folks that are people focused or more motivated by relationships. And so what that might mean is that building friendships or being parts of the team or feeling that personal connection may be more motivating for them. And you can see this when you talk with some folks around like group projects or teamwork. When you start to ask them what they like about the job or what they liked about that project or what they like about the work that they're doing, usually the first thing that they start to talk about gives you a good sense whether they're more people motivated and more task oriented, right? And an example of that is we may have like a real complex project, and a person that's an I or an S that's more people focused is going to be more excited about the fact that maybe the project had an impact on some people that really benefited them in some fashion. Like I do a lot of nonprofit work. And so a lot of their excitement about the work that they're doing isn't the fact that they completed their documentation to get their grant funding. It's that they had an impact on people with disabilities, for example, or that they built a team of people in the community that were able to approach some of those problems or challenges, and they liked working with those folks. That same situation on the task side, they may be more motivated about the challenge of trying to bring people from different industries and different worlds together to achieve that common purpose of maybe being able to help people with disabilities more effectively. Or it might be the problem solving that went into getting some of the obstacles out of the way. Same projects, same opportunities, but you'll have different people in those groups that are motivated a little bit differently just based on kind of where their personality tendencies tend to fall. So again, people versus task in a real kind of quick and dirty way. If you ever want to kind of test that out with folks or help them understand that, or you're debriefing this with somebody, I always just like to ask them, tell me what you like about your job. And I will tell you, I've never had it fail where the first thing that they talk about is it's either a people thing or a task related thing. And you can help draw some of that conclusion or correlation to them about the DISC data and what they like about their role or their job. All right. Second thing is sort of assertive versus responsive view of the environment. And what I mean by this is how do people look at things like structure, rules, laws, process, things of that nature. And folks that have that more assertive view of the environment, they are comfortable with changing rules, laws, structure, and process if it helps them achieve a means and to be able to accomplish things. They're more comfortable making in those changes. And so what happens with folks that tend to be a little bit more assertive in terms of their view of the world is they tend to think and act a little bit more quickly. They're more of the gut feel kind of people that you know. They tend to tell more than ask. They like to kind of shape the discussion as opposed to respond to a discussion. They kind of have that gut feel and trust that things will work out. And because of all that, they're typically kind of comfortable working in ambiguous situations where it's okay to just kind of wade in and we'll figure it out and we'll kind of see how it goes. And so that's kind of that assertive mindset. And that's what the D's and the I's kind of share from those tendencies. When we look at the responsive side, these are folks that are comforted by following the environment rather than changing it. And so when they look at like structure and rule and process and things of that nature, they see safety and consistency, and they want to kind of maintain that consistent, safe environment that's predictable for themselves and others. They try to avoid trouble and they try to stay out of, and I'm using trouble in quotes here, because that could be mistakes. It could be getting in trouble like with a client or maybe your direct supervisor or something of that nature. But it's kind of that sense of trying to stay on the good side of whatever the rule, the law, structure, process would be. And so they like the order that sets standards and expectations, and they want to have a little bit more of a predictable sort of environment. And so to help people really kind of understand this, and if you want to have a little bit of a fun as an icebreaker with a group, is I always like to pick somebody out, preferably a D or an I, because being more of that assertive side, they're a little bit more comfortable standing out in front of the group and talking off the top of their head. Some of your responsive folks may be a little more hesitant to speak up and things of that nature. But I like to just ask them about their route to wherever we were today. So recently I did one of these workshops at a golf club, and I just asked one of the eyes in the room how fast they drove when they came that day. Weather was great, interstate highway nearby. And what you'll find is that, at least been my experience, when I get people to talk about driving habits, it usually draws out the difference between assertive and responsive. Because assertive folks will tend to drive as fast as they want to, because maybe it's fun to speed. If you're like me, you're running behind and you're late and you're trying to hurry up and get there, and you're okay with the risk of a ticket in order for you to be on time, and you're willing to assume that risk. And I guess I'm outing myself as an I while I'm saying this, but these are, kind of the reasons why it's maybe somebody as a D or an I may look at things like a speed limit and say, yeah, I acknowledge that probably makes sense, and I'll follow it when I need to, but right now I need to do something different to kind of safely get myself where I want to go, but hopefully closer to the time that I need to. Responsive folks, and this is always interesting for me, and if you're a C or an S, feel free to chuckle to yourself. You don't have to out yourself here. But usually when I ask C's and S's this question, they, on an interstate highway, they will speed, but they will only speed typically 5, 7, or 9 miles an hour over the speed limit. And that's the formula that they have been told or that they believe in that would allow them to go fast enough, but not get a ticket. And so when they have that behavior that is helping them go as fast as they want to without getting that ticket, that's a responsive type of action in the environment, and trying to act out of making sure that you're not getting in trouble, so to speak, within the constructs of the law, or in this case, the speed limit. So
I am going to out myself. I'm a very high S, and I will purposely put my cruise control at 9 miles an hour over, because I feel like that's the cutoff. So, yep.
and it's weird, like it's always odd numbers, right? So like it's just funny how it's kind of come out that way. And I even did this one time with about 5 participants from a county sheriff's office. And so you could see everybody kind of get quiet about what they wanted to admit to. And in case you're wondering, one of the sheriffs popped over and told me afterwards, he's like, 10 miles an hour, you're probably fine, at least if you're in this particular area. He's like, unless it's rainy or like dangerous or high traffic, that sort of thing. So it was nice that he felt compelled enough to try to explain a little bit further for me for my own safety of what I could get away with.
Exactly.
But this becomes a fun way to kind of talk about it in a way that doesn't leave people too defensive. Usually everybody laughs a little bit, but I think it's kind of it's one that almost everybody relates to. And it's a pretty clean way to kind of talk about that difference between a CS or a D and an I. So I see I've got some other Kevin and Kelly apparently picking the 9 miles an hour like Heidi as well. So Renee, I noticed your question popped up about the percentages. You actually have not missed anything yet. So one of the things that I wanted to just throw out to you. So I've been doing the disc for, I was trying to think about the actual date the other day. I'm pretty sure it was 2003 when I got certified. So I don't want to date myself too much, but through working with a couple vendors along the way, not with this current vendor, but one of those vendors along the way, those percentages are what they shared with me for their population, the general population of the United States over time. And so I still continue to share these numbers because I'm guessing if they've changed by a percentage point or two here or there. But in general, the US distribution, the general public, this is the percentages of roughly where those dominant personality styles fall. And so when you start to think about that a little bit, especially in situations where you have broader groups that really are more reflective of the general public, I tell my folks that work in customer service and things like that, when in doubt, guess S, because you got about a 7 in 10 chance that somebody's an S. Radically different numbers. Okay. Could be. I'm just sharing what I'd seen along the way, and this is pretty reflective of what I've seen. I do a lot of work in the behavior sciences and the medical space. What I see there is tons of C's and S's. The businesses that I've worked in that are a little bit more engineering focused, I see tons of D's and C's, right? And so when I share those percentages with folks, I'm trying to give them a general perspective of the general population, but the type of work that you do and the type of organization you have is probably going to be a little bit more specific based on the things about you're doing and the work that you're doing with. So yeah, so Mandy said she works with fundraisers and they're full of I. Absolutely, because you want a whole bunch of people that are comfortable going up and striking up conversations with a variety of different folks and being comfortable with being able to do that, and hopefully following up to get some of those contributions. Kevin's talking about having a lot of sales leaders or COOs that are Ds. And that's pretty reflective of the fact that those two roles have to be very metric driven and very focused on goals and targets. And those are very comfortable spaces for Ds to be in those directive spaces. And so, so some good comments there. I appreciate that. And so I guess trying to just basically kind of get back to that notion of what's the DISC measuring? It's really kind of in those two spaces, that people versus task and that assertive versus responsive world. And so just piecing that together, those task focused folks, people that are assertive, they're in that D space, the assertive ones that are people focused in the I, responsive people that are people focused in the S, and the responsive folks in the C area being conscientious and responsive and task focused being C's and conscientious. So if you've never really dove too deep into DISC, for me, this is about the easiest way to explain it. And it's also the easiest way for people to be able to use this when they don't have the benefit of having somebody else's Cloverleaf data. The great thing about Cloverleaf is as one of my clients, you don't have to really know this. I'm trying to give you a quick frame of reference, but we're going to really work hard on the data that's inside of Cloverleaf when it comes to your personal growth development and the team dynamic things that we're working on within your specific teams. All right, so I was just going to scroll through here real quick, see if there's any questions that I might have missed along the way. So Kelly said, I'm doing DISC workshop this week with IT hypos. They're all individual contributors and a part of a cohort. They don't work as a team. They each come for something. Any tips or activity suggestions or tips? Hold that thought. I've got some activities up at the end that I wanted to kind of show you. So I will definitely hit those along the way and show you some that I typically use and share with you some of those that I'll use with groups. Ways to integrate it into the day-to-day work. And somebody just added one in there, bumped me up there. Ways this can help people understand their teams more, be managed, etc. I'll talk a little bit more about that too, Mandy, kind of as we go through here. And yeah, so I think we're good there. So let me kind of bump ahead a little bit and just talk about kind of a way I use Cloverleaf. And so in a one-on-one setting, where I typically go to if I'm doing a one-on-one coaching session with somebody after they've completed Cloverleaf, my first thing is I always want to look at the data and the results from their perspective and what's interesting to them. I'm certainly going to do some homework and have some thoughts and some ideas about some things that I want to kind of mention, and maybe ways that I can pull out some of that data that reflects some of the things that they've already told me that might be opportunities for them or challenges or things of that nature. But I always like to start with what stood out to them, because I think it engages them a little bit more to talk about the things that they agreed with, the occasional things that they disagree with, and maybe the things that were interesting or things that they just they were unsure of, or questions that they might have. My favorite thing on when people say they disagree with the result, I tell them, find somebody that you trust and just go ask them and say, hey, I was doing this thing with Cloverleaf and it said I might have this tendency. Do you believe I do, or do you see that in me? And you will be surprised more often than not, your friends, or their friends, I should say, will absolutely reinforce the data for you without you having to have a debate about the legitimacy of the data or the validity. And so that's usually a good way I kind of tackle that one, because it always makes me laugh, especially with assessments in general, but particularly with DISC, because you get the questions too, like, how do they game this? Or like if somebody wants to game it and answer it a certain way. And I've always felt like, especially with DISC, like, all you're doing is you're telling me what your prejudices are towards certain behaviors when you're trying to quote unquote game it. Right. And if, I was working with somebody and they were a high C. And so, one of the things in there was about being persistent. And she said to me, "I'm not a nag." And I said, "Wait a second, like who said anything about nagging?" Right. And then like we had to stop and reflect a little bit about the power of being persistent, the right times to be persistent, and what was her own self view of herself and being persistent and asking for her and being consistent about trying to receive information. And so I always kind of chuckle with those things that folks disagree with or they're worried about gaming it, because it usually says more about what behaviors that they tend to think are appropriate or good or bad, so to speak, than anything else. I always want to, in that debrief too, give them time to read the narrative a little bit. So you see on the screen on the right, I just kind of blew out my results a little bit. And I'll give them some quiet time if they haven't done that, just to read through it and look through it a little bit. As a high I would happily just sit there and talk off the top of my head most of the time. But I know the S&C clients that I work with want to think and reflect a little bit. I would love to think that they've all thought and reflected before we get together, but it doesn't always necessarily happen. So don't be afraid to give some people some time up front to re-review maybe some of that data if it feels to you maybe they haven't necessarily prepared. And part of that, I'll kind of click through the style descriptions, and then I'll kind of point them towards the coaching tips and cue up the importance of the emails. And I don't know about where you're at in your Cloverleaf journey. I can't remember, gosh, how long it's been, but I'm probably approaching a couple years with Cloverleaf at this point. And I can tell you by far, as amazing as my coaching is, the number one thing I get feedback on is the timeliness of the coaching tips that come through emails, or when they go to look in the system for things that specifically are helping them through a conflict situation or things of that nature. And so, I really want to emphasize to them, these are those tools that can help you when I'm not necessarily here as a coach. And that really helps them understand how they can kind of maximize the value of Cloverleaf itself. When I'm working with teams, I'll take the approach a little bit differently. And I have to confess that I stole this from Stephanie Licata in another workshop, but I will actually use the SWOT method to debrief with a team. And so usually what I do is I'll break them into, groups of like 2 or 3, and I'll give them a SWOT matrix on a PowerPoint, and I'll give them the team page, and I'll have them open up the team page and ask them to look at the strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities and threats for the team. And that usually does a good job of driving some insights from them about kind of where they thrive as a team and maybe where they struggle as a team. Then I'll also have some observations, because, I'm always going into these, just like I'm sure most of you do, knowing what's maybe particularly bothering your team or one of the reasons why they wanted to do this. So I'll show them how that data can kind of reinforce that. I'll encourage them to find themselves on that team page and then find some of the key members of their team and remind them how to access those coaching tips. And then I always spend a little bit of time with the team thinking styles and showing them how they can kind of compare a couple of people. Because what I really want to emphasize with them is that the power of this system is having the data and using the data at the right time. And so making sure that they really understand that if I was on a team with Heidi and I had to have a difficult conversation with her, I could pull up our comparative data. I don't have to be an expert in any one particular system, and I can get some really strong coaching tips on how to approach Heidi and to be able to engage with her in those difficult situations. And so making sure that they kind of understand all those tools once we've kind of walked through and talked about what the data means to their respective teams. And then I've got some different exercise and reflection questions that I will use, and I'll show you a few of those here in a couple of slides. And so this is actually a team SWOT that I did recently with a group of let's see here, when I built this would have been actually a group of auto mechanics. And so I have a client that is a family-owned auto shop. They have 10 mechanics that are on their team. I coach the owners of the auto repair business, but they wanted to talk about how could they work a little bit more effectively as a group and a team. And so would put this SWOT together. I let them fill it out. I actually put this one together based on the data and responses they told me. And then this is what I was using to sort of fill in the blanks a little bit with them. And then I shared it with the leaders of the team as well. And so just trying to point out for them, you know, for instance, that like one of the threats for them is they had super high C's on their team, as you would probably hope the mechanic who's fixing your brakes might. But when you have a lot of high C's, there's probably a high bar of acceptance for new hires that may come and join them, and they're growing. And so helping them understand that they need to be able to help those people feel accepted, help them understand that they're working to the standard, and then putting those mechanics in less of a skeptical position of a new teammate, but more of an encouraging position with them to want to reach those standards or support them to meet their high quality standards. And that's just one particular example we were gleaned from that data. We used a few assessments there, but the specific DISC data point would have been around having that high C kind of comparison within that group. And the fact that they want everything to be correct and 100% accurate and super high quality. When somebody new comes along, everybody's kind of giving them a stink eye a little bit and maybe unsure of them and maybe not the most welcoming until they've kind of proven themselves. So that's one way we kind of highlighted this, so that they might potentially not lose a new mechanic and a technician who could be pretty effective, but maybe wasn't feeling like he might be accepted in their group, or she might not be accepted in their group, based on kind of how their natural tendencies sort of flow. So a couple things to just think about when you're working with your groups from a facilitation standpoint. You know, let the data guide your facilitation decisions. And what I mean by that, you're looking at the team. And so if you've got lots of S's and C's, you know, give people the time to write and think and kind of process the data when you're working with them as a group. They're not going to be the group where you just throw a question out to and they're all going to feel comfortable in answering, and you're going to get a really active kind of conversational dynamic. If you got lots of DNIs, you need to keep the pace moving, because even though you're talking and sharing a point about something, they're probably thinking about 3 other things while you're talking. So you've got to figure out, how do you keep it moving at an appropriate pace to keep their attention, but also not necessarily blow past some of the things that you want to be able to identify with them. The data suggests. This has been one of the most powerful phrases I have used with groups and individuals when talking about difficult or challenging messages that people might take defensively. And so all of us run into situations where you see maybe a limiting behavior or a derailing behavior. The great thing about the DISC and data assessments, it allows us to say the data would suggest that you come off perhaps a little bit unempathetic and a little bit unconcerned about the people around you, which is a much cleaner way than saying you have no empathy and you need to figure out how to be appreciative of the people around you and have some care and concern for them. And so I think you can bring up a lot of really challenging discussions and some real powerful hot button issues that can really help individuals and teams grow. And one of the good ways to do that is by phrasing it as the data would suggest, and then kind of laying it out there. And so I just wanted to share that with you. It's been really helpful for me. And sometimes it's hard to bring up some of those things that are potentially a thumb in somebody's eye, or a thumb in a team's eye about their behavior. And this is a good technique that I've found to be able to do that. The other thing I like to do, especially in group, is use the behavior I observe to reinforce the tendencies. So one of the exercises you'll see here in a second is I'll break everyone into group by a D, I, S, or C. If I watch the eyes take 10 minutes to get started because they're all giggling and laughing about stuff, I'll make them aware of it and show them that, yes, look, you're enjoying that relationship, but we're really not getting to the work that needs to get done right now. Sometimes I'll put groups of S's together and you'll see them all working collaboratively, but no one will make a decision to write an answer down for a group assignment or to decide who they should start with. We'll point it out to them and show them, hey, feels kind of awkward here, right? Nobody's really moving the group forward. That's what happens when we have a lot of S's. We have good camaraderie, but maybe we slow to make decisions and we struggle to keep things moving because everybody's afraid, or maybe not afraid, but hesitant potentially to step on each other's toes. And then when you do get pushback from people, remember to point back to the data. And so a couple challenges that we have when we talk about these tendencies and we try to explain them to folks is we have to typically talk about people in absolutes, right? We talk about a high D or a low I. But the reality is we're a combination of all of those tendencies, and we can use all of them. And so when I say a high D does this or a high I does that, we all know that naturally not every high I or high D does those things. But based on how maybe their S and C might fall, or maybe how high or how low that D might be, they may respond or react a little bit differently. So just reminding them that to explain things, we need to talk in absolutes, but that's the power of Cloverleaf, because all of the analysis that's happening in the engine on the back end is accounting for all those exact scores. And then we have to be able to find ways to transition clients to understanding that they're a blend of all those styles. So kind of that same notion, right? Like helping them understand that, you know, for me, for instance, as a 24S, you know what, it's not my most natural thing to display steady behaviors, but I can do it. And the real trick for me is making sure I take the time and the effort and energy to do it when the situation calls for some appreciation of my team, or trying to do some things to make sure that the team feels good about their contributions working with me or working with clients, etc. All right, so got a couple recap questions, but I'm going to kind of skip through those because you'd asked a little bit about some of the example exercises, and I thought I'd kind of roll through these kind of really quick here. And like you said, Heidi's got the recording, and Heidi, if you want to send the slide deck out to everybody too, so they can have these, that's great too. Cool. You know, and so sometimes in terms about flexing their style, I might ask them to look at a key person in the room that they work with, and then use the team data to write down that dominant personality style, read the description of the tendencies, and you can see some of the questions here that get them to think about, maybe it's, you know, a key partner on a team, could be their leader of that team or what have you. But I want to have them in that exercise spend some concentrated time thinking about, you know, some things that maybe they hadn't thought about, those people that the data brings out, thinking consciously about the strategies to approach them based on what the data is saying, and giving them some time to think about this. This can also be a really good one-on-one coaching exercise as kind of some homework coming out of a coaching session. And you might be talking about a particular employee or a boss or a peer or whatever, and kind of giving those assignments to think about how they would flex their style in the right situation based on the tendencies of the folks that they're working with. Some group exercises that I'll use is I'll ask them to identify a song that would be a theme for each of the personality styles. And so as they kind of read and understand the styles a little bit, what would be a popular song? Sometimes I'll use the football analogy depending on the room. And if you've got a group that kind of knows football pretty well, I would ask them to pick the different positions that might represent the 4 personality styles. There's no like 100% right or wrong answers, but some of the answers I look for and those kinds of questions would be, you know, the D's possibly being the quarterback, because they've got to make instantaneous decisions and they've got to kind of drive the team on the field to kind of overcome some of those challenges. The I's might be, sometimes it's a coach, sometimes they're cheerleaders, right? But they're trying to influence people and motivate people to overcome. We talk about in a football environment that offensive lines are typically good examples of steadies, because they have to kind of work as a team of 5. And if one offensive lineman goes in the wrong direction, it could ruin a play. And if you know anything about football, you know those offensive linemen tend to like to stay out of the spotlight a little bit. So that kind of adds a little bit of an example to that. When we talk about referees being high C's, sometimes I've heard wide receivers talk about high C's because they have specific routes they have to run that are specific yardages. High I's could also be wide receivers because they tend to be the divas of football teams, right? So depending, you know, there's some flexibility in how they answer, but the key is we want to hear them kind of talk about those different styles and how they could present in some of those positions. I've seen this done with other sports, done this sometimes with careers and kind of stereotypical careers based on that. We'll also ask them to maybe name some famous characters, fiction, nonfiction, that would maybe represent different personality styles as well. So those are some other fun ways to get them to kind of talk in disc language and identify the characteristics of other people, or in this case, characters that they might see who might represent some of those personality styles. All right. So that is pretty much what I had for you today in terms of walking through with the different disc tendencies, kind of talking about the differences between the two primary constructs, and then giving you some different examples of there, kind of how to use it inside for one-on-one inside of Cloverleaf, as well as with groups, and a handful of example exercises there. And those were just a few example exercises off the top of my head. If you've got some others you want to kind of brainstorm together with, I'd be happy to share some other ways I've maybe used the data or kind of work together with you on that. But with that, I think I can go ahead and open the floor, Heidi, if anybody's got any additional questions, or if there's anything I missed in the chat room that I could go a little deeper on, I'd be happy to do that.
Does anybody have any questions or any other points that you'd like to check in on about? I know DISC has been, for me too, it was the first assessment that I was introduced to. And whenever anybody asks me, which one should I start with? You know, where should we start? To me, DISC is that one. Mainly just because it is such a, an easy one. It makes it very clear. In my past life, I worked in the construction industry. For those of you who don't know, I was an accountant before I came here. And so high I accountant, which was a little rare, I guess. Lots of C's in my world. But for us that, coming from that world of engineers, accountants, IT, it was very, we like the black and white. And so DISC is a way to do that. So I always suggest for those of you who are working with teams that really like to just know something simple, easy, something just a quick way to just lure people in and give them a taste of what an assessment can really bring to them, just as a way to do that. So yeah. Yes, I'll be sending out the recording as well as the slides. And so those of you who have registered, I will send that out later today as soon as the recording is done loading on my computer. And then I'll get the slides from Brad. I think I actually probably, if they're the same, I'll probably already have them. But I'll have those as well. And then, like I said, any past recordings are also out on Vimeo, our Vimeo account. I'll link those back in the chat as well, just so you have that. So any other questions or anything else you have for Brad?
All those might come in. The last slide that you'll see in the deck, I left my contact information. So if anybody wants to, jump on a Zoom for an hour or so, talk a little bit more, if there's some way I can help out or you want to give me a call, feel free.
Thank you so much, Brad. And I am attaching the upcoming webinars. Like I said, we'll have one on change management at the end of at the big first week of May. My gosh, that's next week already. And we'll also have one on Enneagram. And I'm also attaching our Vimeo site so you can get to past recordings as well. That's where our recording for today will be, but I will also be sending that out to anyone that's attended today. So if you need anything else, just let us know. Happy to have everyone. Thank you so much. Thanks, Brad.
Thank you. And thank you all for your attention today.